a Russian nationality. And so, in my life, I watched as different people reacted to this statement. Some people would react with judgment and criticism. Some people would be skeptical. Some people would just be confused. Some people curious. And occasionally, some people would ask me if I am 100% absolutely, positively, for sure, that I'm not from Kazakhstan or China or some other Asian country. And to this I reply, well, not as far as I know. I myself define myself as a third culture child. I grew up under the heavy influence of Western culture, Chinese culture, and Russian culture. And I've had the incredible privilege of experiencing all of these unique and beautiful cultures at a deeply personal level. But I was also born and grown up for the first 7 years of my life in Russia, more precisely in the Buryat region. I come from the Buryat indigenous minority, which comprises less than 0.3% of the Russian population. And even though I've had this privilege of experiencing such a unique culture and me myself being a third culture child who has grown and developed and had the incredible opportunity to learn from all of these different cultures, when I was young, I was incredibly embarrassed and ashamed of my background. Because no matter where it was that I went, whether it was my home country or China, I always felt like a foreigner because I couldn't quite relate to the thoughts and opinions of everyone else. The past me probably would have been astonished to death to see myself here, giving a speech to all of you. And even as I stood out there in the backstage, I hesitated. My mind wondered if I really wanted to share such an intimate and personal detail with the audience. I wondered if I truly wanted to share this personal detail that I spent 15 years trying to cover up with elaborate explanations and stories, and occasionally even lies. Trying to cover up a story or a background that I was so inherently embarrassed about. I was scared of being criticized, scrutinized, and called out. I remember how in first grade, I first began school. I was incredibly excited, and my teachers were very intent on explaining to me why they thought I was Chinese, and even though I didn't speak Chinese yet, and I didn't quite have the English ability to explain to them my elaborate and complicated background. I remember how in second grade, I grew incredibly angry because out of the entire Russian population, I was the 0.3% who was unlucky enough to lose the genetic lottery and be born Asian and into a minority. When I was in fourth grade, I remember how our teacher asked us to give a presentation. All of my classmates were psyched. They were talking about their own backgrounds and their own experience. They would talk about China, Korea, Norway, the United States, and so on and so on. And I was confused. Which culture should I talk about? And so instead of talking about my Buryat culture, the tradition, the celebrations, the food, and my own experience as a child growing up in this incredibly beautiful culture, I decided to talk about things that would be taken as stereotypically Russian. And even though I did grow up in Russia, I didn't quite relate to this Russian culture quite on such a deep and emotional level as I do to the Buryat culture. I was angry. Why was I at the same time Western, Chinese, Russian, and Buryat, and yet nothing but a foreigner to everyone? I began to push and shove myself into a shape that I wasn't in order to fit in with everyone. And every time I attempted to break out of this irrational fear, I would be herded right back into this cage of self-restriction. And no, it's not anyone's fault. I was so irrationally embarrassed and afraid of people finding out about my true self, my identity. But nonetheless, like every other teenager on this planet, I was inherently embarrassed of something that made me fundamentally different from everyone else. something that made me fundamentally different from the crowd. And so I began to hide away the story of my name. And the story of my name is that when my parents first had me, they decided to name me after a goddess in the Buryat culture and the Buddhist religion, Tara. And when people in the future, or my classmates or my friends would ask me, why is it that your name is Dari? I would explain to them that, oh, my name comes from a edgier and cooler and more interesting version of the name Daria. Or where in fact the name Daria was an extremely popular name in the Russian community. And if you were to visit Russia, you'd probably hear this name being called out 15 or 16 times right out there on the street. And because I was so inherently embarrassed of people finding out about my own culture and how it's different from the Russian community and how it's different from the third culture community, I was afraid of people finding out about the true stories that made me different from everyone else. I was on a clear path to believing that I had to erase as many differences as possible in order to succeed. And even in a community as open-minded and diverse as the third culture kids, I was inherently insecure and embarrassed. I believed that I would much rather become a homogeneous byproduct in this crowd of people, much rather than continue to stand out and be so confused and embarrassed of the things that made me different. I would wash away my culture and my background, and so I washed away my identity. When the topic of discussion came to politics, I never ever voiced my opinion because I was afraid that this would lead to people questioning me for my background. I would hide away my heritage, and so I hid away an inherent part of myself, my childhood. I began to forget my great-grandparents, the warm memories of us sharing the Buryat culture. I forgot how we would eat pozl, a Buryat dish, or how we would celebrate Sahalhan, a Buryat celebration of New Year. I was afraid and insecure, and so I began to define myself differently. I didn't feel like I could relate to anyone in the Russian community or the third culture community. So I chose the easy path out. I decided to conform to stereotypes, norms, expectations. But today's speech isn't quite about how I was embarrassed of myself and everything that made me different, my background and my culture. And the speech isn't exactly about how I grew to learn to accept myself for these differences that I have from everyone else. It is about the fact that virtually every teenager out there feels embarrassed of something that makes them so fundamentally different from everyone else. Something that makes them feel like an outcast. Or something that, as some of them much later learn, makes them a unique individual. This internal conflict is a reflection of how all of us believe that to a certain extent, we have to erase our individuality to fit in. And we believe that fitting in is the key to success. We're so afraid of the modern day hypercritical judgment that we would much rather hide away our identity, our true self. And so to avoid criticism, we say nothing. We do nothing. We become nothing. But hey, at least we fit in, right? I remember the thing that led me to open up to my community and to my friends. My friends and I were having one of those usual talks where we talked about our opinions, worldviews, how we all come from different cultural backgrounds, and how we have very, very different views on politics and the world. And so one of my friends suddenly asked me to talk about my culture because every time the topic came to their own backgrounds and how we grew up, I would always stay silent. And so they asked me, and in their eyes, I saw a genuine curiosity towards me. I saw the fact that they truly wanted to encourage me to open up to them. And I realized that I had two choices. I could either continue to push and shove myself into a shape I really wasn't. I could let this environment consume me. I could become a wallflower, a flat color in this back of this wall, or I could let this environment build me. I could let the environment breathe strength into me, encourage me, empower me. Of course, I was incredibly lucky to be surrounded by a loving family and accepting friends. And undoubtedly, my school, my friends, my global education with such an interesting outlook on the world, all were the factors that helped me understand myself and accept myself in this process. But I believe that I was the catalyst. I was the catalyst which made the decision between blending in with everyone else or freeing myself from the cage of self-restraint. I was lucky enough to realize the importance of accepting myself, of being proud of my culture, of realizing that as an individual, I should be proud of the things that make me so different from everyone else. And so love everything that makes me fundamentally different. Bad or good, these differences are what make me, me. And so when people ask me to talk about this experience or how I overcame my emotional obstacle of accepting myself and being in this incredibly confusing culture, or as I now call it, a very amazing opportunity to learn about the world, I call it the Breakfast Club-esque experience. And some of you may have watched the movie The Breakfast Club, which is about how a group of students come together in a detention one day, and all of them are labeled to be stereotypes. There is a stereotype of a nerd, a stereotype of a popular girl, the stereotypical jock that does nothing more than wrestle and has nothing on his mind other than that. And these stereotypical students come together to create this iconic film portraying the message of accepting yourself and your versatile, intricate, and complex individuality. And these polar individuals come together, and notice the word individuals, because these individuals are fundamentally different from each other. They all have their own lives. They have things that make them different and have things that make them different from each stereotype that they're labeled into. And so they continue to be stranded in fear. What if they don't fit in? What if they're cast out by the school community? So they choose to conform.